Chairman Lynch, you may go ahead and deliver your opening remarks.
Still muted. All right, there we go. Thank you, Amy. Good morning, everyone. Great to see such great attendance. First of all, I know that there's a call coming up, a caucus call on the postal issue at 11:30, and members on oversight. I'm fully engaged in that. So when I jump off, we hope that Chairman Bera will be able to take over at that point, and we'll proceed with the testimony and the questions as originally planned. I hope everyone is staying healthy and safe during this interregnum. Before we begin, I'd like to first thank Chairman Bera, the chairman of the Foreign Affairs Subcommittee on Asia, Non-Proliferation, and the Pacific, for hosting today's briefing jointly with us, and the National Security Committee. I'd also like to thank Ranking Member Grothman for requesting that we hold this briefing, and for his and Ranking Member Yoho's leadership on this important issue. The Uyghur people are predominantly Muslim, ethnic minority that live in Xinjiang Autonomous Region in northwest China. Since at least 2016, the Chinese government has been carrying out a systemic campaign designed to subjugate and assimilate millions of Uyghurs into Chinese society and to crush political dissent. The harsh methods employed by Chinese authorities include detaining millions of Uyghurs in, quote, vocational education and training centers, close quote, where they are forced to learn Mandarin and undergo daily indoctrination in Chinese Communist Party propaganda. Those not in re-education camps are also often deported from Xinjiang in order to work in factories elsewhere in China. China has also created a highly invasive technological police state in Xinjiang using facial recognition technology, involuntary DNA sampling, and mass data collection to monitor and intimidate the local population. Xinjiang authorities are also reportedly using pregnancy checks, forced intrauterine devices, sterilization, and even abortion to reduce the Uyghur population. Let me be clear. China is committing demographic genocide against Muslim Uyghurs in Xinjiang, and Beijing must stop these human rights abuses immediately. In recent weeks, the United States has taken multiple steps to hold China accountable for its actions in Xinjiang. In May, Congress passed the Uyghur Human Rights Policy Act of 2020, and last month, the State Department imposed sanctions against Xinjiang Production and Construction Corporation. The United States cannot lead this effort alone. The international community, including global business and multilateral institutions, must also do more to hold China accountable for its human rights abuses in Xinjiang. To that end, I am pleased to be a co-sponsor of H.R. 6210, the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, which would ensure that goods made from labor in Xinjiang cannot enter the U.S. market. One final point. It is critically important that Democrats and Republicans together continue to stand shoulder to shoulder in condemning China's oppression of Muslim Uyghurs. This will send a strong, unified message to President Xi Jinping and our allies and partners that the United States will not tolerate what is happening today in Xinjiang. I'd also like to thank our witnesses for briefing our subcommittees today. And with that, I will now turn the floor over to Ranking Member Grothman from the great state of Wisconsin for his opening remarks.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Thank you very much for having this hearing. I really appreciate it. It says a lot about Congressman Lynch that he's willing to do this. First of all, I hope we can have maybe more hearings in the future because it is such a horrible thing. And when I look at it, as you mentioned, with the face recognition and the DNA, you can see the face of totalitarianism in the future. You can see the degree to which, if you have part of a population you don't like, you can control them, you can oppress them in a way that totalitarian regimes in the past could only dream of. I'd like to thank each of our panelists today for taking the time, especially Mr. Issa, who's briefing us all the way from Germany. It's disturbing when we learn that the Chinese Communist Party, what they're doing to their own citizens, and it is now undisputable that the Chinese Communist Party is engaged in wholesale repression of this entire culture. According to communist ideology, Uyghurs and other ethnic minorities living in this country are threats simply because they maintain their own religion and own cultural practices. There is obviously a huge amount of atrocities, over 1 million people in concentration camps, widespread use of forced labor, and birth suppression, which is almost beyond belief, includes invasive birth control measures, forced abortions, forced sterilizations. These tragedies are being perpetuated to overcome the culture and religion of the Uyghur people. I think what goes on in communist countries is when they see a religion, one of the things they don't like about it is it's something the government can't control. And in a country like communist China, the government wants to be able to control everything, which is why they almost always will be opposed to any sort of religious freedom. Although I'm heartened by the recent passage of the Uyghur Human Rights Policy Act and sanctions implemented by the Trump administration, the repression has not yet stopped. The Communist Party has engaged in a massive disinformation and propaganda campaign. As we will hear from one of our panelists, the Communist Chinese Party even engages in hostage propaganda to whitewash what it's doing to the Uyghur people and silence Uyghur critics living abroad. We must not fall victim to this propaganda. Instead, we must continue to shine a light on what the Chinese Communist Party is doing to the Uyghur people, and we must consider whether further legislation is necessary. I am going to point out that I think China probably feels very good of itself because they've had so many material advances in the last 20 years, but people care what the United States and Western countries think. And we have to make it clear that to be an advanced country does not just mean making a lot of electronics or having a lot of cars. To be an advanced country means freedom. And I think that's why this hearing is so important. Hopefully the Chinese leadership hears about it. Hopefully they realize that we are appalled. And hopefully the American business community, some of which I think are happy provided they're making money and don't care what's going on with the Chinese people. Hopefully this committee hearing will also cause some of the well-heeled American business types to wake up and realize that when you're dealing with China, you are encouraging this sort of behavior. So again, thank you, Congressman Lynch, for doing this hearing.
Okay, the gentleman yields. Chairman Bera, good to see you, my friend. You're recognized for 5 minutes. Thank you.
It's good to see you, Chairman Lynch, and I want to thank Chairman Lynch, my good friend, and the ranking member, Mr. Grothman, as well as my colleague and good friend, the ranking member, Ted Yoho. I'll keep my comments short so we can get to the witnesses, but I think as Congressman Grothman just pointed out, just having a briefing like this shines a light on the issue, and we know it really does send a message to Communist China that we are watching and we are paying attention. And we are leading with our values of human rights, of personal dignity, of religious freedoms. And I couldn't agree any more with the chairman and ranking member on oversight, that it is important for the United States, along with our Western allies in Europe and Australia and elsewhere, to come together to make a bold statement that these types of atrocities in the 21st century are just not acceptable. And I know this is not a partisan issue on our subcommittee that the ranking member, Mr. Yoho, has been a strong vocal advocate, as well as Congressman Sherman and others, that we do have to hold the Chinese communists accountable to this. And again, in the 21st century, atrocities like this should not be acceptable, and we shouldn't stand for it. So with that, I will yield back, Chairman Lynch, and look forward to hearing from the witnesses.
The gentleman yields. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The chair now recognizes the ranking member, Mr. Yoho, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and ranking member. Glenn Grotham and Ami Berra for doing this. This is such an important topic. I think we need to look at the very basic underlying principle. Does a country have a right to prevent terrorism? I think we'd all agree with that. But how they do it and to what extent is where this hearing is about. Should they work internationally with other countries? I think we can all agree that we should do that to prevent terrorism, to have national security at home. But at what extent does this go on into? Should there be internment camps? Should there be the forced education or re-education, we'll call it, forced labor, indoctrination in the Chinese Communist Party doctrine? As Mr. Grothman brought up, the Chinese Communist Party cannot survive with free thought or religions outside of the Communist Party, because in their hierarchy, there is no entity higher than the Communist Party. And so I think, as Glenn brought up, we need to have this as an international movement. And then we also need to invoke what's going on in Xinjiang to these corporations that are buying products from there. And we need to have, not just from Congress, but from the American public and publics from all around Western democracies, denouncing these companies and take that economic engine away from China. I think if we do that, I think we'll have a strong response. And then, you know, we've had hearings with Chairman Berra on our committee, and we have seen the reports of armed crematoriums. We've had reports of people in our office of the forced sterilizations. The Han Chinese move into their families. They're forced to have sex. Basically, they rape the women, and they live in the homes of the Uyghurs in Xinjiang and the other provinces. But to have armed crematoriums in these labor camps or re-education camps is it's an oxymoron. Why do you need armed crematoriums for dead people? We've heard stories of vans showing up with people in there, they're screaming, and they never come out. And if we truly believe that this will never happen again after Auschwitz and the other death camps in Germany, if we truly believe that, not just as a nation, but as a world community, we need to bring this to an end. China needs to open up their policies. They need to have eyes on there of Western press, and they need to be transparent. And then when those findings are found, they need to be held accountable. And I yield back, and I look forward to this hearing. Thank you.
Gentlemen, Bills, we are privileged this morning to be joined by Mr. Dolkan Issa, President of the World Uyghur Congress, Ms. Jessica Batke, Senior Editor at China File, and Ms. Maya Wang, Senior China Research from Human Rights Watch. Thank you all for your willingness to participate and for all the work you've done to illuminate the oppression and activities that have been going on here for some time. We'll now welcome Mr. Dolkan Issa for his opening statement.
Good afternoon from Germany. Chairman Lynch, Chairman Berra, Ranking Member Grossman, Ranking Member Yahoo, and the other member of Congress. Thank you for organizing this briefing. My entire family a direct victim of Chinese genocidal campaign. Like all Uyghur in the diaspora, I'm an indirect victim. Genocide experts call us secondary survivors. We have suffered unbearable trauma for nearly 4 years. I was a students' activist for human rights and democracy in my homeland of Uzbekistan in 1980s, and I was expelled from the university. And my wife received political asylum in Germany in 1996. I was able to bring my daughter to Germany, but I never saw my parents again. In May 2018, I heard my mother died in a concentration camp. Then, January this year, 2020, Global Times quote of my older sister Arzgul. She was saying that I had similar China by talking about the disappearance of my family and that both of my parents had died. That was first time I had news of my father in the more than 3 years. Today, as I speak to you, I don't know when and where my father died and where is his cemetery is, and where is my sister is known. I had unconfirmed news that my older brother, who was a mathematics professor, is serving a 17-year sentence. My younger brother has disappeared since 2016. I don't know where their children and the other relatives are. I have nightmares that they are locked up in concentration camp. I have been relentlessly harassed and my family has been punished for my activism. Chinese Communist Party continue to use its power and influence to manipulate international institutions, deny activists and the civil society space in international institutions, and detain or disappear the relatives of the Uyghur activists who speak out. Today's briefing is about what should be done. The Uyghur crisis should be matter for the United Nations Security Council. It has a mandate to prevent and halt atrocity crimes. The Security Council has not acted. General Assembly has not acted. Secretary General has not acted. The High Commissioner of the Human Rights has not acted. The UN Human Rights Council has not acted. Last October, 5 countries held a United Nations side event at the General Assembly in New York, United States, Germany, Netherlands, UK, and Canada. This was the first time a camp survivor testified at an official UN event. More than 2 years after the atrocity, we are known to the world. This October, at least 25 countries, these countries had signed a joint letter in July 2019, should bring the issue before the General Assembly of the United Nations, where China does not have a veto. It should be 30 or 50 countries, in fact, working together. In this context, we urge you to make substantial effort to address Uyghur crisis as a part of coalition of states, especially with a partner in European states. Their desperate need for united and a coalition to end Uyghur genocide, and these international efforts require US support and leadership inside and outside United Nations. Sustained effort must be made to reach out to leaders in the developing world, especially from Muslim majority states, to empower them to speak out and join the coalition to end the Uyghur genocide. I also kindly urge you to quick pass the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, but the administration should not wait for the Congress. US should act now to declare that all products from the Uyghur region are tanned by the forced labor. This will protect American consumer from buying face masks or clothes or ketchup made under Chinese government genocidal forced labor shame. Your committees can also conduct oversight of the Uyghur Human Rights Policy Act passed on 17 this year. This first report to Congress law is due in exactly 1 month on September 17. The FBI must report what is doing to protect Uyghur American from threats and surveillance by the Chinese police. Please conduct the hearing on stopping this violation of the Uyghur American civil rights. United States should announce joint sanctions to stop this harassment, working with other countries where thousands of diaspora Uyghurs suffer the same civil rights abuses like Germany, Sweden, Norway, Canada, and Australia. We also urgently need language to use describe the ongoing crisis to reflect the horrific reality of the situation. We need a genocide designation used United States and international institutions. Finally, American company must stop doing business with Chinese company that profit from civilian and the radical profiling of the Uyghur. You can go on Amazon right now and buy a camera from Dahua or Hard Vision. Dahua and the Hard Vision installed thousands of cameras in the mosque and the concentration camp. They have $1 billion contract with the Xinjiang government. It is shocking that they are allowed to make profit from American consumers. US banned export to some of this company, but import should also ban it. Other countries should do same. I also urge action, pension funds, cotton apparel, Uyghur refugees, Radio Free Asia, universities, medical field, and Xinjiang denialism. I can mention them later if there is some time. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Issa. Welcome, Ms. Batke. You are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you for having me here today. I'm here to speak briefly about the history of repression in the region, types of incarceration and repression we're seeing there today, and then I'll touch briefly on US and international actions with regard to this crisis. First, I should mention that the relationship between the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region and Beijing has been fraught since the founding of the People's Republic in 1949. Ethnic minority peoples living in this region, largely Muslim, so Uyghurs, Kazakh, Kyrgyz, and others, have often had their culture and language and religion interfered with and suppressed. So repression and suppression is not new. However, to keep this as brief as possible, I'm going to start looking from 2009, when there were inter-ethnic riots in the regional capital of Urumqi. And that marked a point at which the government really ratcheted up its security presence in the region. And from then, we started seeing outbreaks of violence throughout the region and eventually elsewhere in China. Some of these were almost certainly instigated by the state itself. Some of these were very likely unplanned, spontaneous outbursts of anger by citizens who had to undergo day-to-day repression. A few of these were likely what we would classify as terrorist attacks, although it's really important to note that there is no evidence that these are linked with any outside group or even to each other. These were individuals taking these actions by themselves. Then from 2014, we saw the central government really began to think about changing its policies in the region. And this culminated with moving Party Secretary of Tibet, Chen Chengguo, from Tibet to the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region in 2016. And that's led to the camps that we're seeing today. So to talk a bit about the types of incarceration and repression we're seeing in the region, I'm sure all of you are already aware of these camps. Many of you have mentioned it. These were begun to be reported internationally in 2017. Conditions and treatments in these camps vary a lot depending on what camp you're in, where in the region you are, what your supposed infraction was. You could be tortured in these camps. You could have sexual violence used against you. You could be malnourished, and you can even die. Some of these camps include forced labor, where you are forced to work in a factory that's attached to the camp or nearby. But almost all of them include forced Chinese language classes, forced displays of patriotism, and cutting off your communication with people outside these camps. In addition to the camps, there's the formal incarceration system. So hundreds of thousands of Uyghurs and others at least are in these prisons. And there's reports that as camps are being closed down, people are just being transferred directly into these prisons. So they're not being set free, they're just being incarcerated in a different place. And then also there's hundreds of thousands at least of Uyghurs and others in these non-voluntary, what they're calling surplus labor transfer programs. Often people are moved from southern Xinjiang to northern Xinjiang to go work in factories, and they don't really have the opportunity to say no. Outside of this system, people are still constantly surveilled and watched, and their behaviors are restricted. A co-panelist is going to speak about surveillance, so I won't go into too much there, but it's really important to note that the surveillance stops people from practicing their religion freely, practicing their culture freely, associating with other people. It really breaks down familial and social bonds of trust. And the Chinese government is also destroying public spaces, religious spaces. The goal here is to change how people identify themselves. They want people to stop thinking of themselves as of a certain ethnicity or culture first, and have them think of themselves as a PRC citizen first. The US Holocaust Memorial Museum has labeled what is happening in the region as constituting crimes against humanity. Finally, and very quickly, to talk about US and other international responses to this crisis, I'm sure there are a number of levers at the US government's disposal that I'm not aware of, but a lot of the ones I'm aware of, the US government has actually already enacted, right? So withhold release orders from CBP to stop goods made with forced labor from entering the country, the Uyghur Human Rights Policy Act, global Magnitsky sanctions. So what I'll talk a little bit about here is what advocates now are working for, given that these things are already in place. I know a number of advocacy groups that are working to get the UK and Canada to enact their own sanctions with their own mechanisms that are parallel to the global Magnitsky sanctions. I do think more countries taking tangible steps like that does undercut Beijing's narrative that the US is just taking action cynically. Other advocates are supporting work to get, as people have mentioned, businesses and consumers aware of forced labor and to stop products made with forced labor from entering our supply chain. And finally, one question that has been raised a number of times that I've heard is revolves around the 2022 Olympics, which will be held in China. And the question really is, if this were happening in another country other than China, would the US be comfortable participating in Olympics where people are being rounded up and held in camp? Thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Ms. Bakke. Ms. Wong, you're now recognized for 5 minutes for an opening statement. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me today. I am going to talk about the use of mass surveillance in Xinjiang and a couple of other issues. So Human Rights Watch have been documenting the use of mass surveillance, primarily the collection of biometrics in Xinjiang. The authorities are essentially putting under the microscope of Xinjiang's residents. Their behaviors, their relationships, their movements are being watched by automated system as well as human beings who are conducting that surveillance to gauge their level of loyalty or lack thereof towards the Chinese Communist Party. Last year, Human Rights Watch published a report on a big data system called the Integrated Joint Operations Platform, IJOP. And I'll explain a little bit about how it works to give you a sense of what's going on. The IJOP is a bit like, the mother of surveillance systems in Xinjiang, if you would. It's connected to the multiple, probably tens of thousands, if not more, cameras throughout the region. These cameras are put along roads and highways to recognize automatically the number plates of cars, the color, the attributes of cars, to track these vehicles all the time throughout the region. These cameras are also placed to recognize people through their faces, but also through their attributes. Do these people carry an umbrella? Do they wear a mask? Using these kind of attributes, facial recognition technology, number plate recognition technology, the IJOP system picks out and tracks people through the region. In addition to the IJOP being connected to these cameras, the system also are connected to the checkpoints through the region. So in Xinjiang, every access point to a village, to a city, and throughout the city, every 500 meters or so, there are checkpoints. And in these checkpoints, there are these things that look like security gates where people have to pass through in order to get to places, go to the supermarket, send their kids to school, and so on. And these checkpoints have these data doors, which when you pass through them, they recognize your face. You have to swipe your ID card, iris scans, and also unbeknown to you, it is also covertly pulling the identifying information of your phones off your phone. All of that data is being sent to the IJOP system to match and see whether or not you are who you are, but also to figure out whether or not you have some kind of unusual activities. The IJOP system, taking all of these sources of information together, picks out people whom the authorities consider to be unusual. And through reverse engineering a part of that system, we are able to find hard evidence that suggests that the authorities are not picking out, well, terrorists or criminals or people who are genuinely dangerous, but picking out people who use too much electricity, for example, donate money to mosques, who are using VPN, a kind of virtual private network, to get across the firewall. People who use WhatsApp instead of WeChats, because according to the authorities, all these behavior are problematic because they indicate some kind of disloyalty towards the government. Some of these people who are picked out by the IJOP system are interrogated, and some of them have been sent to political education camps. I interviewed a girl who was educated in the US, and she went back to Xinjiang just for a visit during summer vacation. She was caught because she used a VPN to access her US university website to check homework. She was put in political education camp for over a year, despite the fact that she has health problems that requires surgery. So this is one case, and this is one example in which people are impacted by the use of mass surveillance. And that leads to widespread fear because people don't really know who's watching them, what is watching them, and what criteria under which they're being thrown into camps. And I've also been asked to talk a little bit about the other impacts of the Chinese government's policies in the region. I think it is important to know that the use of political education, mass surveillance, forced labor, and allegations of birth control methods, some of them have equivalents in the rest of China. For example, in Tibet, some hundreds of nuns and monks have also been put in political education facilities. However, the use of these policies in other parts of China, if at all, are not expressed in the same form. They are often not as coercive as they do in Xinjiang. But having said that, I think it is important to recognize that what's happening in Xinjiang is an expression of a symptom of the wider and deep, severe human rights abuses that's taking place throughout China, and that I think the US should work with its allies to tackle the deepening repression under President Xi in a holistic manner by having a China strategy. I've seen the US now has a strategy paper that just came out months ago. But I think that is just the beginning of a policy that really should look at the multifaceted expressions of the severe repression that is happening in China today, or that we're going to see worse to come in the next few years. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now recognize myself for a quick question. Ms. Wang, I read some of your material. I've been following your coverage for some time now, and you write about the Integrated Joint Operation Platforms, or IJOP, the Integrated Joint Operation Platforms, and how the Chinese government is using it to conduct what they call predictive policing against the Uyghur community in Xinjiang and also abroad. So I guess I would like to drill down on that, because I see the threat not only being something that's going on in Northwest China, but I see it also as an exportable danger. That, you know, you think about what's going on in some other authoritarian countries in Eastern Europe and elsewhere, in Korea, North Korea, you know, and I'm just very, very concerned about the export of that technology to other countries where this whole constant monitoring can be amplified and used in a more global fashion. Is that technology being used outside of the Uyghur areas in Northwest China, in Xinjiang? Is that something that China is using countrywide? And do you think that the current platform could be exportable against the wishes of you know, the global community and you know, the EU and other parts of Asia? Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for the question. I think that, well, I didn't have enough time to go into this, but although the use of mass surveillance in Xinjiang is pretty extreme, it's really on a scale. The rest of China are moving, I think, towards that direction in the sense that some of these mass surveillance designs and systems are similar to Xinjiang. It's just not as visible and extreme because, well, first of all, we don't have political education camps. So, and also you don't have as much integration as you see in Xinjiang, where surveillance really lead people to end up in arbitrary detention. But the collection of biometrics, DNA, facial images, people's phone identifying information, we have observed similar uses. Similar collection in the rest of China. As to the export of these technologies, so far we have observed the Chinese government exporting these systems through its companies to other parts of the world, primarily countries which has relationships, other authoritarian countries. So for example, through its kind of digital Silk Road, in Southeast Asia, in Central Asia. However, that kind of export is primarily about facial recognition systems rather than kind of integrated big data systems like the IJOP. I call this export kind of off-the-shelf export. You pick out a facial recognition system, you sell that. But instead, what is happening in Xinjiang, a very kind of multi-dimensional package of surveillance. I haven't yet seen that kind of really wholesale approach to such export. And that's important because facial recognition systems, theoretically, you can still try to circumvent that. But once you have such multidimensional surveillance, it's almost impossible to evade. And that is why Xinjiang is so frightening. And that's why we haven't seen such a wholesale export. But if we already see that, it would be, well, I think terrifying for anyone who supports democracy. Finally, whether or not these systems, well, how do we speak to the collection of data outside of China in democratic countries? I think that really deserves a lot more careful research. There are risks concerning Chinese companies and their collection of data and surveillance and control outside of China. But I do think that there is, we need to be careful in concluding just how much data is being collected and used by the Chinese government. And I look forward to seeing more of that. But I would just say that we need that research conducted by support from governments, because otherwise, I mean, this is a very big project to just examine how much risk are there and how do we craft a proportionate response while at the same time ensuring freedom to access information. Thank you.
Thank you. Back, and I would recognize the ranking member, Mr. Grothman, for 5 minutes for his questions. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Can you hear me? I'd like to do a follow-up on your question there. As far as export of these technologies, you mentioned regions they might be exported to. Can you give me specific countries?
Sure. Human Rights Watch has documented the sale of facial recognition systems from Chinese state-owned companies to, I think, at least Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, and I cannot remember another one. And also in Cambodia. And so these are at least the countries that we have had documentation from Human Rights Watch, but other researchers have looked into such export. One of the people that I recommend for your next hearing is Valentin Weber, who is at Oxford University. He's looked into and compared what he called the technosphere of China and Russia. And if you look at how China exports its technologies and its, well, not only technologies, we're also talking about laws and journalist training that predispose a society more towards Chinese government style of control. You see the comparison between Russia and China, and you see basically Chinese technosphere of control is so much broader, well, than I guess Russia's, essentially encompassing much of the developing world. And there, I think I'm happy to also share my experience advocating for the cause of Xinjiang in Indonesia, how strong the Chinese government's influence there is in Muslim majority countries. And I think we're perhaps missing or failing to examine and counter such influence in these countries.
They have a lot of influence in Indonesia, which is a very big country, you're saying.
Sorry,
You are saying that China has a lot of influence in Indonesia, who may adapt this sort of thing at some time, you think?
Well, by influence, I mean more than just technological influence. So in Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, I was responding specifically to what you said about the sale of mass surveillance systems. But in Indonesia, for example, when I went to visit to try to advocate for the cause of Xinjiang, because part of what we want to do is to ensure Muslim majority countries also speak up about the situation in Xinjiang. I think that's very important. However, what I found was very strong influence from the Chinese government in terms of kind of manipulating the press conversation and to say that this is all kind of a plot for the US to maintain its power dominance in the region, rather than
The other
right and wrong.
The other two countries you mentioned are formerly part of the Soviet Union. Do you believe they are involved in those countries just because they are totalitarian countries and the fact that they were formerly involved in the Soviet Union is irrelevant? Or do you think there is a connection to the Soviet Union insofar as these other countries are using these technologies?
I think these countries, Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, are important to the Chinese government also because the control over Central Asia is important. I don't have any evidence, but I would imagine that the collection of faces, of Turkic faces, which would be similar to Xinjiang faces, and these are also countries where some Turkic Muslims have fled to, would be strategically important for the Chinese government in ensuring control over Xinjiang.
Okay, and I have to ask Mr. Isa one more question. Can you explain how the Chinese government expand a little bit, exerts control over Uyghurs, even living abroad, by canceling passports or by issuing one-way travel documents?
Well, Chinese government, as I said, not only controls the Uyghurs in Xinjiang, East Turkestan, also China's long arm getting in exile for the Uyghur activists as well. I personally also victim of this. Chinese government trying to manipulate United Nations human rights system, particularly. They're trying to make a pressure to the UN Human Rights Council Secretariat to provide a list to China. Actually, it is against the UN rule, but Chinese missions constantly make a pressure, and sometimes UN also shares a list to the Chinese mission, Chinese government, and the Chinese government uses this list and trying to cooperate some other country to trying to stop and accreditation. Even sometimes, 2017, when I was the UN permanent indigenous issue in New York, I was kicked also from the United Nations, and I had the accreditation, everything, but no explanation, nothing. Just that U.S. Ambassador Harry Kerry and the German ambassador are working along for 1 week, but couldn't solve this problem. Then next week, finally I got accreditation. Again, just as an example, but Chinese government also uses different of strategy, different of way, monitoring controls the Uyghur, normal or ordinary Uyghur refugees as well. Sometimes Chinese security service police call them and ask them don't attend any political activism because they are use the family hostage strategy. And saying if you attend something, then you have to see them on your family members. And also sometimes Chinese government and send some spy to the outside the country, and also sometimes ask some Uyghur community find someone to cooperate with the Chinese government. It was there is a 2-3 clear example in Germany in 2009. 4 Uyghurs hosts was searched by the German federal police because they are cooperating with Chinese government, and collected information among the Uyghur community and information also World Uyghur Congress and provide to the Chinese government. So Chinese government and use different of way and hostage family and send the people and threat and sometimes call even threaten. Sometimes also we got some black email and also beginning of this year, I personally physical attack even some guy who is the relative of the governor of the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region. They asked me, you should not talk about my uncle, because you have to think on your family member. So really trying to physical attack to me. Well, this is the situation. So we can say the Uyghurs activists, particularly Uyghur activists, and they really threatens the Chinese government. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. The gentleman yields back. I now would like to recognize Chairman Bera, and I would also ask him, I'm in the queue on another hearing, and I would ask you to exercise your 5 minutes, and then if you would take over the call of show here so you can recognize other members as well. Thank you so much, Mr. Bera. I really appreciate your support and cooperation on this. Thank you.
Certainly. Thank you, Chairman Lynch. Yeah, this would be a question for any of the witnesses. I think Mr. Issa, was just talking about, some of the challenges within the United Nations putting together a multilateral coalition. And, I'm proud of some of the work that we've done in Congress in a bipartisan way to try to shine a light on this issue. But I also recognize if it's just a bilateral United States, and China issue, it's going to be very difficult for us to get the Chinese to change their behavior. But I do know that the Chinese do fear multilateral coalitions if the European Union, along with the United States, along with other like-minded allies that value human rights and democratic principles, we can have much greater impact. I do think building that coalition through the United Nations, given UN politics, could be difficult. And I'd be curious from the witnesses, I think Ms. Botke talked about the United Kingdom and others, if we were to, in a multilateral way, put pressure on the business sector, et cetera. And then a second question would be, I've not heard much coming out of the Muslim-dominated countries, the Muslim majority countries, and in this particular case, knowing the oppression of the Uyghur Muslim population, I would hope that you could put a coalition of Muslim majority countries together to put pressure from the human rights angle. Maybe start with Ms. Botke, if you'd like to talk about how best we approach this and what the possibilities are, and then the Muslim majority country question as well.
Thank you. I think you're right. The UN is shown to be very difficult as a place to maneuver, especially since we are no longer on the Human Rights Council in the UN. But there's a number of things that other countries have been doing. I know that in the last year, there's been several letters from a range of countries coming together and sending to China to denounce what's happening. The US has not been a party to some of those. And I also think that, again, as I mentioned earlier, other countries do have sanctions mechanisms already in place. So working with countries to help figure out how they need to, what information they need to help enact those, or encouraging other countries to develop mechanisms by which they can do similar things. I do think also another thing that I saw last year at the UN General Assembly was sidebar events that were held around the UN by a coalition of countries, but not just with the United States. I think there's a range of actions and mechanisms that can be done in concert with allies that don't have to be through UN mechanisms. In terms of Muslim majority countries, yeah, this has been something that people have brought up over and over again. It's really striking, actually. Mr. Issa mentioned how there was a letter by a number of countries in 2019 denouncing what happened. There was also several days later a counter letter, and that was signed by some 40 countries, many of which were these Muslim majority countries that have supported Chinese policies, or at the very least have remained silent. I have not seen a good concerted effort to reach out and to get those countries on board. I do think that that's an important part of any national coalition. It strengthens it strengthens the sincerity of what's going on. I have yet to see any public evidence that that's been happening in the international community.
Mr. Issa, do you want to add to that, particularly on the question of how we build this coalition of Muslim majority countries to really speak out?
Well, so today, Chinese government mostly, we have seen very concrete evidence, particularly United Nations, Chinese government set up coalition, this quite widely country. 2019, July, 25th country, mostly in the European and the Western country, sent jointly letter to the high commissioners, asked the Chinese government to close the concentration camp. And then just 1 week later, Chinese government set up the coalition, more than 50 countries, and support the Chinese repression policy towards the Uyghur. Among them, 16 is Muslim country, unfortunately. So among them, this 25 country, non-single Muslim country, but is among them 50 country is 16 Muslim countries. So Chinese government now is to set up more coalition Muslim country, not only some Muslim country, not only silent, even openly support Chinese policy. This is the reality. So that's why I believe the United States can use your government use its capacity, can trying to set up coalition, because we as a World Uyghur Congress, civil society, we trying to contact the government. For example, last year, we sent one delegation to Malaysia, Indonesia, some other country. Civil society and some human rights defender support us. But unfortunately, some civil societies in this country also very corrupted. They are at the beginning, then later, Chinese ambassador, Chinese consulate was very active. Immediately next day, and visiting the civil society, saying, "Oh, invite East Turkestan to Xinjiang," and visiting them. Then they are silent. So that's why maybe U.S. government can set up the coalition and provide information. Then maybe it's more useful. But mostly, I believe United States can cooperate with the European partner. Germany and some other United Kingdom, Australia as a country is more effective.
Thank you for that. And I realize my time is up. Let me go ahead and recognize the ranking member, Mr. Yaha, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. I want to thank all the witnesses. And there was a question brought up, is this technology being offered to other countries? We have reports that it's going around to autocratic and despotic leaders around the world. You already mentioned a few of them, but we also heard Russia, Iran, and to Venezuela via ZTE. And so these are things we need to really pay attention to. In addition, China is also offering their form of socialism with Chinese characteristics, which is basically George Orwell's 1984. It's their form of communism in the 21st century. Something else that was brought up, we have legislation in the process. We're working with Senator Rick Scott out of Florida for the 2022 Olympic to get these companies to boycott China for their human rights abuses. And we need to document that. And so my question to the panel, and you've already brought out the ineptness of the UN Human Rights Council. Has anybody from the UN Council been sent there to Xinjiang to investigate? That's question one. Question two, has any representatives of the free press been able to visit Xinjiang or the re-education camps to report? And then if you know of any entities that you know of that have been able to go and investigate, because what we have to do is we have to expose this to the Western democracies in the world and just say, never again. And we need to stand behind that saying, never again, because it's going on and we need to stop it. Questions? Mr. Issa?
Yeah.
Go ahead, Mr. Issa.
Yeah. Well, one moment. Yeah. So, sorry, Congressman, can you repeat? Was your very short question?
Do you know of any entities? Has anybody from the UN been there to
Okay.
go there? And then, do we know of any entities in the free press that have been able to go and investigate and report on this? Because we have to expose this. The word's not getting out around the world like it should.
So, High Commissioner of the UN Human Rights, Bachelor, she recused Chinese government to visit the concentration camp. At the beginning, she recused 2019, and the Chinese government also saying welcome. You can visit. It is possible, but still not happening. Last year, when I was in Geneva, I met High Commissioner office. I not directly talked to High Commissioner, but in the special assistant. We asked why, still not happening. Chinese government invited you, you want to go, why not happening still? And the Chinese mission, Chinese government playing games. High Commissioner office recused. High Commissioner want to visit to Xinjiang, Xinjiang. Then Chinese mission saying, are you ready to go? Then is okay. Then we will ask. Then disappeared. Is already happening twice. So that's why Chinese government just
Okay.
game.
Let me ask Ms. Botke real quick. Do you know of any entities that have gone there from the Western press to be able to investigate that? I know CNN had a reporter maybe a year and a half ago. Do we have any follow-up in that?
Yeah, so there's been a number of reporters that have been to the region over the last few years. It's very, very difficult to go. They often have to do so kind of clandestinely. I would say that the reporters that have been allowed into the camps have all been at the behest of the Chinese government. So they've been shown essentially Potemkin versions of the camps.
Right.
What they're seeing there is not an accurate reflection of what is happening inside the camps. But I would also point out that in addition to getting more reporters in the region generally, there's plenty of evidence already that this is happening. We have satellite imagery, we have the Chinese government's own procurement documents, leaked policy documents, their own propaganda, we have witness testimonies. So I agree that more reporting would be helpful, but there's plenty of evidence on the record that makes very clear all of this is actually occurring.
I appreciate that. What we need is action, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all.
Great. Let me go ahead and recognize my good friend from California, Congressman Sherman, for 5 minutes.
Thank you. The Chinese tell us that these are vocational schools. I've never seen a vocational school with barbed wire around it, except when it's a prison with a vocational school located in the prison. We've got to put these human rights abuses in context. This is a regime that is oppressing the people of Taiwan, or threatening the people of Taiwan, oppressing the people of Tibet, ignoring its responsibilities to provide autonomy to Hong Kong and clamping down there, and of course, what the Uyghurs face. I should point out, as the member from Los Angeles, that China has a stranglehold, or we've allowed them to have a stranglehold, on the movie studios. You see, China only allows 35, some would say 40 movies into China total, and they're an important part of the market. So the Chinese government can decide whether this studio or that studio gets this or that movie into what is by population the largest market in the world. We all saw the movie with Richard Gere about Tibet. They're not going to make one of those anymore, because the Chinese government not only controls the content of the 40 movies they let in. If you're planning to get it in, you better not put this but they can retaliate against any individual studio. In contrast, we certainly don't limit China to 35 or 40 different electronic devices and say after you reach 40 you can't import anymore. Some sanctions we have are with the idea of almost forcing a country to change its views. Regime threatening sanctions. Sanctions against Iran that some would say we're successful in getting a great deal. Some would say we're successful in getting us a less great deal, but everybody agrees got us as far as we got by putting the regime in a very difficult position. China is a much more powerful country. So we cannot sanction them to the point where just by our actions, the regime is facing a threat of its continued existence. But sanctioning does accomplish a number of things. First, it meets our moral responsibility to make sure that American consumers are not buying products with slave labor, that those who are torturing Uyghurs are not visiting Disneyland in Anaheim. Second, it's only fair that China pay some price for what they're doing to the Uyghurs. And finally, and we can hope that we can reverse or at least ameliorate the policy of the government in Beijing, the combination of things. First, there are those in China who oppose this human rights affront. Second, we can reach out to the people of China and let them know what's happening in their name with their tax dollars. And finally, we can force China to pay a price worldwide and especially in the United States. And I want to go back to an area that Ami Berra has dealt with and address this to Mr. Issa, and that is, okay, we have 16 countries in the Muslim world who have at least put the Chinese government on notice. But in the United States and in Europe, the average person who focuses on foreign policy, many people just walking the streets know what China is doing to the Uyghurs. To what extent does the average person in Pakistan or northern Nigeria, what have you been able to do to make this a cause of Muslims worldwide? Now, I know that you've gotten some support in Turkey because the Uyghurs are not only a Muslim people, but a Turkic people. But have we reached the point where there's any Muslim country that is thinking of where average people are thinking of boycotting at least some Chinese goods as a result of what China is doing to the Uyghurs?
Yeah, you are right. So actually, Pakistan is the country all the time support the Chinese policy. So far, we have witnessed Imran Khan, Prime Minister of the Pakistan, had an interview with different of international media, BBC, Deutsche Welle, all. They asked the Uyghur issue. All the time, the answer is very clear. He's saying, I don't know this issue. Once, and 6 months ago, one BBC reporter asked him, I don't know this issue. If I know this issue, I will talk. After 6 months later, another reporter asking same questions, the answer is same. So actually, he knows very well because Turkestan is the neighboring country, and we have in the historical tie with Pakistan as Uyghur people. But it's CPEC, Chinese-Pakistan economic corridor. It is the main reason why Pakistan continues to support China, because it is $60 billion project. So Pakistan is the Chinese money, needs the Chinese money. So that's why Pakistan all the time, not only silence in the strong supporter and the alliance and the partners, the United Nations, some other place. Of course, Turkey is always a country and spoke sometimes on the Uyghur human rights issue, United Nations, 2019 February, Foreign Ministry Çavuşoğlu speak on this issue, Human Rights Council's meeting. But after a couple of months later, Erdogan and visit China, attending G20 meeting, and he U-turn on this and support Chinese policy.
Let me just squeeze in something else. our committee, and I know people are watching this around the world and will want to know what the United States is doing, and I'll just want to put in the record a few of the things that our subcommittee has done under the leadership of Mr. Yoho. When I was ranking member back in 2018, we had a hearing on repression of the Uyghurs and U.S. policy responses. Of course, we had another hearing back in December, I believe it was, authoritarianism with Chinese characteristics. And we, of course, had the Uyghur Act, elements of which have become law. And what's very important is just last month, the House passed the Malinowski, Sherman, and we had other co-sponsors amendment to the NDAA bill, which would prohibit exporting American products to China that can be used to commit human rights abuses against the Uyghurs. And so these steps are more than just a resolution, more than just a hearing, but a way of underlining for the world how important the oppression of the Uyghurs is to the people of the United States. And I thank the chairman for his indulgence and yield back.
Great, thank you. Let me go ahead and recognize the gentleman from Tennessee, Dr. Green.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Can you guys hear me okay?
We can.
Thank you both, Chairman, and both ranking members, and thank you to our witnesses today. I'm honored to have the chance to discuss one of the worst human rights abuses really in our lifetimes. What China is doing is absolutely reprehensible. China might not even be around today, or at least would have had a completely different history if it wasn't for the Uyghurs' faithfulness in the 8th century. At a time when the Tang dynasty was on the verge of collapse, the Uyghurs proved themselves to be faithful and consistent allies. The Untitled rebellion was raging against the Tang dynasty, threatening their very existence, and the Uyghurs helped the Tang retake Chang'an and Luoyang not once but twice, ultimately saving the dynasty in China as we know it. The real reason why they won't let the Uyghurs practice their Muslim faith is because communism is in and of itself a faith. It is a religion of the state. It is horrified of anyone worshiping Allah, Jesus, or any ideal outside of the state because that would amount to heresy. They want no freedom of religion, no freedom of speech, no freedom of thought. To allow religion is to allow moral authorities that might question communist principles. It's the power found in the moral principles in religions that they fear, the kind of power that Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. used to show that racist Jim Crow laws were wrong no matter how legal. The Origins of Political Order, or in the book, The Origins of Political Order, Francis Fukuyama talks about how it is religion that gave the West, the Middle East, and India rule of law throughout history and in the present day. And that is what the CCP hates. It hates any notion that there would be any limits on what the rulers can do. They view things like thou shalt not kill as a pesky impediment to justifying any means to support their end. So they're tearing down crosses from churches and putting CCTV cameras in them. They're putting Muslims in concentration camps and raping the women left behind, and they're organ harvesting from Falun Gong practitioners. While many of our allies and many of our own U.S. companies go parading around as buddy-buddy with China, we're watching a literal Orwellian 1984-like scenario play out. It's disgusting. It ought to make us sick. And I want to speak specifically today about the NBA. While they protest some things, they have a word for their view of China's paramount evil. Okay. Title-winning Warriors coach Steve Kerr had this to say about what he slanderously called a Muslim band of Donald Trump, something even the Supreme Court would not call his prudent national security measure, which wasn't about religion at all, for crying out loud. Allies like Saudi Arabia, whose population is nearly 100% Muslim, were not in the travel restriction at all. Yet on goes the NBA, and Kerr calls that reprehensible while ignoring China's depravity. Where's his moral courage? His heart, when Chinese Muslims are actually being persecuted, 1 million placed in concentration camps and others raped? He says nothing. And this is not just him. He's one example of countless in the NBA who have something to say about our president, but because doing so makes money. and nothing to say about China. Why? Because doing so makes money. That's disgusting. When asked about Hong Kong protests, Kerr declined to comment. When asked about human rights abuses like this, he switched the topic to U.S. gun control. He and many others say they're not familiar, have not seen it, no right to speak, or need more research. Well, maybe if they used Google, they could find it in 2 minutes. But no, Kerr and countless others don't care about equality. They don't care about human rights. LeBron James is saying how he had a tough week because we dare get upset about their immoral silence on this issue. Well, I'm pretty sure the democracy protesters in Hong Kong and the Chinese Muslims had a heck of a lot worse week than he did. And to top it off, these coaches and players who say they know nothing about this have a training camp right in the middle of Xinjiang, where the concentration camps and human rights abuses are happening. A person's a person, no matter their religion, ethnicity, or nation. I just wish the NBA could recognize that. Mr. Issa, can you share with us more about what it does to your people for influential organizations like the NBA to turn a blind eye to what's going on?
Well, yes. So, and you are right. CCP is really not only today against the Uyghur Muslim. Actually, CCP, Chinese Communist Party, is anti-religious organization. And today's Chinese Christian, Tibet Buddhist, Uyghur Muslim, Falun Gong, all suffering by the CCP. Even organ harvesting, the main organ harvesting, Falun Gong, is also Uyghurs also victim of the organ harvesting. Even Chinese government advertisement was a halal organ harvesting. You know, it is meaning it is just Uyghurs. So many Uyghurs today transfer from the detention to the other provinces in China. Some used for forced labor, some used for the organ harvesting. So it is the because we are Muslim, and some Muslim Arabic businessmen use the halal organ. This is the Uyghur use for this. So today some other Western company also continue cooperate with the Chinese government. For example, German company Adidas and the Nike and the Australian Strategy Policy Institute already issues a report in March saying more than 80 Western company, including US and the German and the European company, used Uyghur forced labor. You know, so and today, yes, US government sanctioned some Chinese company. Heart region, Dachau I already mentioned, but still is Amazon continue sold this is Heart region and the Dachau video camera. So that's why now it is very important. All Western company should stop the business in China. Business should not be as usual at the moment.
Thank you, sir. I believe my time is up.
Thank you. Let me go ahead and recognize the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Perry, for 5 minutes questions.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Sure appreciate it. And thanks to our guests that are here. Listen to the conversation. I want to absolutely want to associate myself with the comments from my good friend, the gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Green, Representative Green, regarding communism and the fact that there are so many around the world and of course right here in the United States that are willing to make money and turn a blind eye to this issue as though it doesn't exist. And in that vein, I'm wondering especially about our allies in freedom-loving countries around the world, and maybe this should be for Ms. Batke, what kind of things that they're doing that might show us the way in this issue where we maybe seem to have lost our way. We forget that we said never again after World War II when we saw the atrocities that occurred in Nazi Germany. But even so, we have turned a blind eye to the communists in the Soviet Union and the Gulag Archipelago that dotted that land, and so many suffered. And of course, all around the globe, whether it's in Castro's Cuba or North Korea under Kim, this oppression and these activities of robbing people of their souls and their lives and their very being continues around the world. What are other free nations doing that we have failed to do that might make a difference? I'm just concerned because we on the Foreign Affairs Committee are very well of this issue with China and the Uyghurs in particular. We have been for years. We've been vocal about it for years, but it's very frustrating, as you can imagine, to look around the rest of the country, whether it's the NBA or the rest of the world, where not much is said as long as people's financial fortunes are at stake. And so if you could kind of lead us down that path a little bit of some things that might be being done by other countries, and if they're not, then we need to know that as well.
Thank you. Yeah, and I welcome any of my co-panelists to jump in and correct me if I get anything wrong. But actually, in terms of government actions, I think the U.S. has taken far more steps than the vast majority of other countries, including European and other like-minded allies. As I said before, advocates here are trying to get the UK and Canada to enact sanctions. As far as I know, we're the only country that has comprehensively done so. And I mentioned before, some countries have signed multilateral letters denouncing what's happening. I think for most countries, that's the extent of what they have done. So the things that the U.S. has done, which is passed this Uyghur Human Rights Policy Act, done some of these withhold release orders. These are things that other countries have not done yet.
That's obviously disappointing, and we believe in freedom across the board in the United States, and it includes freedom to do things that are inadvisable and disagreeable in many cases. What would be a suggestion? You know, I will tell you, I think like many of my colleagues and many Americans, we're disgusted by the NBA's lack of interest or the lack of acknowledgement of these occurrences in China. From your viewpoint, what would be an appropriate action on behalf of the United States towards an organization like an NBA in a free country where the NBA is seen worldwide as a leader and is a role model to be disregarding and to just be disavowing these things or just assuming that they don't occur, what have you? That's problematic for us, but we don't want to overreach. We don't want to tell people what to believe and what to think, but we do think that there ought to be consequences to actions. Is there anything in your mind that we could do would seem appropriate regarding organizations like that?
This is a really, really tough question, specifically for just the reasons that you said, right? The NBA, for example, is a really complex organization. Players don't necessarily speak for the NBA. Coaches don't necessarily speak for the NBA. And this highlights all of the very serious questions that have come about because of how integrated China is now into the world economy. And we are certainly not the only country facing that. For example, in Germany, Volkswagen, the CEO of Volkswagen has been on record multiple times saying they have no idea what's going on in the region, even though they have a factory in the regional capital of Urumqi. So there's just a lot of incentives for businesses to not know, to make themselves willfully blind or to know or ignore what they already know. On the NBA point, I would like to say, though, that I believe Representative Senator Marsha Blackburn sent the NBA letter, and 2 weeks ago they replied saying that they had shut down their training camp in the region about a year ago. So while I agree it's difficult and it's always important to maintain our freedoms here, freedom to freedom of expression and freedom to believe what you want, it does appear that pressure related to this and publicity on this issue did cause the NBA to reevaluate that relationship in some capacity.
Oops, Mr. Perry, were you yielding back?
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I did.
You're welcome. With that, I think Mr. Perry was the last witness. I don't know if Ranking Member Grothman wants to make a final closing comment. Oops, I think you're still on mute there.
Okay, wait.
Right.
You can hear me?
We can hear you now. Yes.
Okay. I just like to thank Congressman Lynch for doing this again. It's very illuminating. It's very important. Its significance goes far beyond the Uyghurs, because I think what we're seeing is the face of totalitarianism in the future. And it's really, I mean, you don't like to say anything could possibly be worse than some of the totalitarian states in the past, but their ability to completely control the population, the ability to completely monitor all that's going on around, is something we haven't seen before. As mentioned, it's being exported to other countries, and it's scary to see what the world may look like 10 or 20 years from now if this technology and complete immorality is used, expands not only in China, but around the world. And I think we have to do a better job, I think, like I said before, of explaining America is a great country, not because of its material wealth, but we're a great country because of its freedoms that we all take, sometimes unfortunately, take for granted. But again, I'd just like to thank Congressman Lynch. I think this is scary enough. I'd like to see a follow-up hearing, in a few months, because I certainly learned a lot today. I learned something from Congressman Sherman I hadn't learned before. So again, thank you for having me.
Great. I'd certainly like to thank the witnesses for this briefing and enlightening us. And I agree with the ranking member, Mr. Grothman, that we do have to have additional hearings on this. We do have to continue to shine a light on this and continue to reach out to like-minded allies to build that multilateral coalition that allows us to keep moving forward on this. It will take a long-term sustained effort, much as what we did in the 70s and 80s with South Africa and apartheid. But it's worth it, because I don't think any of the members on this call want to look back 10 years from now, 20 years from now, and feel like we didn't stand up and do the right thing. So with that, I don't know, Mr. Yoho, do you want to make a closing comment, and then we can bring we can gavel out?
Yeah, I do. And I just want to thank everybody on here, the participants. And as Ms. Botke, as you brought out, there's plenty of information and documentation. It's time for action. The rhetoric, it will build, but until we have action behind it, and that's the purpose of these meetings, is to have significant legislation, as Mr. Sherman talked about and everybody else. So we thank you, and hopefully we can make this a footnote in history to where this ended. It started, but it came to an abrupt end. And with your help, we will. Thank you.
Thank you again to our witnesses for their advocacy and continued work. And with that, we'll bring this briefing to a close, and I'll gavel out. Thank you.